In the past, military conflict had symmetry: soldier against soldier, sword against sword. As modern confrontations developed, the symmetry sometimes wore away. Soldiers fight under rules of engagement that anticipate symmetrical warfare, which are proved frequently inadequate in the conditions of war against terror organizations. Should a soldier out in the field be expected to know who is a soldier dressed as a civilian, who is a terrorist, and who is a simple bystander? Today's asymmetrical warfare is fought in civilian neighborhoods, but the rules of engagement can't always provide clear guidance. Is it possible to set rules that make sense for modern asymmetrical warfare?
Okay, good morning to you. As it was mentioned before, I am Yaakov Achimeir of Israeli television, Channel 1. I would like to introduce our panel from right to left. Dr. Yom Tov Samia, he's a retired general in the Israeli Defense Forces, former commander of the Southern Front in Israel. Next to him is Ran Bar Yehoshaphat, former IDF combat soldiers and an attorney and policy expert. Next to him is Professor Chris Jenks of Southern Methodist University. Lieutenant General David Fridovich, former Deputy Commander of U.S. Special Operations Command, and Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of the British forces in Afghanistan. I would like each member of the distinguished panel to deliver a presentation of 8 or 10 minutes about the subject of the discussion. And I would like to start with General Fridovich, who will explain to us the differences, the major differences between present wars and past wars and different forces. General, please.
Thank you for that. I didn't know I was going to speak about that, so I'm well prepared. That's good. You know, the past differences, actually, that is a good point of departure. The past differences, as the graphic of the cartoon indicated, is that, you know, there was symmetry to the battlefield, and we understood, and we spent a lot of time understanding and training towards defining what an enemy combatant was. And it was normally, in most cases, came from the protagonist country or countries, and very clearly based. But in the situations I declared or spoke about yesterday morning around this time, things had started to change. What we understood is we had to adapt ourselves to the dynamic process of understanding the principles behind rules of engagement. And the first primary principle that I still hold near and dear to my heart is that you will do nothing, again, this is a U.S. military perspective, you will do nothing that will limit the soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine's inherent right of self-defense. That you cannot add anything to what they do, any hesitation or any restriction that would cause them to be in more jeopardy or harm. And that's still a fundamental. And I only saw it abused one time, and it didn't really, and I won't go into detail, I'll do that personally if anybody cares, but I won't do it publicly, because I'm not sure exactly on the full facts of it, but I only heard about it once where a senior made a comment, and you go, that's ridiculous, you can't really, hey sir, all due respect, which coming from another Army officer is not always a well-intended, respectful, term. You really can't do that. This person thought he could, so I'll leave it at that, and again, make it clearer on a one-on-one basis. But that's the guiding principle. You cannot add any type of hesitation or do anything that's going to add endangerment to them. But you also have a requirement to make certain that they are trained and they understand, and not just rehearsed and spoken to, but they are actually trained and understand what they are supposed to do in a variety of situations without doing the what-if drill to death. Because at a certain point, you do have to cut it off and say, look, just get very good at these things. Which brings me to, I think, the second fundamental is that the principle is rules of engagement, and we find this out more and more, and this is, I think, why this panel is so important, is that they are a point of departure. That's all they are. The battlefield is extremely dynamic. You're going to go there with the rules of engagement that you have, not the ones you necessarily fully want. We always have supplemental rules of engagement that come in. Quite often, we like to keep those classified. There's a reason for that. You do not want to give a decision point to your enemy so he understands where your limits are. So you keep those. So quite often, our supplemental rules of engagement in our military are classified at a very high level. Why? Again, you do not want to give that away to your enemy and allow them another gap or seam for them to exploit. So those are the guiding principles that as you get into asymmetric threats and the combatants are not clear, you have to start, in my mind anyway, in my heart, you have to start from to safeguard the force. I gave, on behalf of the Institute, or the center, I spoke to media quite a bit yesterday after the speech, and one of the things that kept coming up is the contradiction in the book Killer Angels, where Robert E. Lee, in the American Civil War, ends up killing the thing that he loves. And that is his soldiers. So to do what he needs to do to make the point about preserving the Union, preserving the South, the Confederacy in this case, he does what? He takes the people that he loves dearly and has been with dearly, and he sends them off and he's in battle with them. That's the contradiction of being a leader. And that came clear in quite a few of the soldiers that you'll speak to almost daily here. And Benny Gantz shared similar, that, you have this balance of safeguarding the population, but also endangering your force, regardless of the threat. How far will a commander go? And this is what keeps you up at night. This is what causes nightmares, that you did not do enough. And it all revolves around rules of engagement.
Thank you. I would like to give the floor to Professor Chris Jenks of Southern Methodist University. Professor Jenks, General Friedovich said that the rules of engagement are only a point of departure. So how can you formulate, exact rules of engagement if there are so many changes in the battlefield?
Thank you. I think to start, it might be helpful just to ensure that we're all thinking or talking about the same concept when we talk about rules of engagement. I find in the U.S. anyway that there's a lot of confusion or misunderstandings about what rules of engagement are and what they're not. So on the slide, what you see there is that the rules of engagement are a subset of the law of armed conflict. So, and you notice it's a subset. It's narrower than what the law would allow. So the larger circle is what the law would allow you to do. And you can see the smaller circle is the rules of engagement. So most often the rules of engagement are going to be more restrictive than the law would allow. Next slide. And that's because the rules of engagement are really the intersection of several things. They're the intersection of the law, the slide you just saw. They're the intersection of operations, about diplomacy, and about politics. So the rules of engagement are this narrow subset of a variety of factors, some of which legal, but frankly, also including operational, political, and cultural concerns. I want to now just shift to the point that General Friedovich was ending on, which is how far will the commander go? And I think the rules of engagement reflect the real tension that General Friedovich identified. I want to read a quote from the U.S. Army and Marine Corps' counterinsurgency field manual that I think outlines some of that tension that becomes much more difficult when you try to operationalize it, which is what some of the leaders here to my left and right have certainly endeavored to do. Leaders prepare to indirectly inflict suffering on their soldiers and Marines by sending them into harm's way to accomplish the mission. At the same time, leaders attempt to avoid, at great length, injury and death to innocents. This requirement gets to the very essence of what some describe as the burden of command. Ultimate success in counterinsurgency operations is gained by protecting the population, not the military force. Yet combatants are not required to take so much risk that they fail in their mission or forfeit their life. So that's doctrine that came out of Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And how do you operationalize that? At the end of the day, that's a nice manual. It's available online, but that has to get translated, communicated to commands. At the end of the day, the Colonel Kemps of the world are going to need to look a young 18, 19-year-old service member and explain to them what they can and can't do and why. And that includes, and perhaps a point of disagreement between me and General Frudovich, that includes you're going to have to accept more risk. There may be times and circumstances when we could do things that would better protect us. Call in close air support, call in artillery. And we're not going to do that necessarily. General McChrystal, the former commander of NATO forces in Afghanistan, I thought was surprisingly candid about what this means. And I just want to read a portion of the tactical directive. The tactical directive is an unclassified. A majority of the specific rules of engagement are, of course, classified, but this is general guidance where General McChrystal is attempting to explain to the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine under his command that yes, you are going to accept more risk. Our strategic goal is to defeat the insurgency threatening the stability of Afghanistan. Like any insurgency, there is a struggle for the support and will of the population. Gaining and maintaining that support must be our overriding operational imperative and the ultimate objective of every action we take. We must fight the insurgents and will use the tools at our disposal to both defeat the enemy and protect our forces. But we will not win based on the number of Taliban we kill, but instead on our ability to separate insurgents from the center of gravity, the people. That means we must respect and protect the population from coercion and violence and operate in a manner which will win their support. This is different from conventional combat, and how we operate will determine the outcome more than traditional measures like capture of terrain or attrition of enemy forces. We must avoid the trap of winning tactical victories but suffering strategic defeats by causing civilian casualties or excessive damage and thus alienating the people. While this is also a legal and immoral issue, it is an overarching operational issue. Clear-eyed recognition that loss of popular support will be decisive to either side in the struggle. The Taliban cannot militarily defeat us, but we can defeat ourselves. I recognize that the carefully controlled and disciplined employment of force entails risk to our troops, and we must work to mitigate that risk wherever possible. But excessive use of force resulting in an alienated population will produce far greater risks. We must understand this reality at every level in our force. And I think that's the tension. How far do you go in protecting the force and the obligations you have to the men and women in uniform while recognizing that at a point, the more you do to protect the force, that's going to come to both risks to the civilian population and ultimately run counter to the success of your mission. Thank you.
Thank you. As I mentioned before, Dr. Yom Tov Samia is the retired general in the Israeli army, former commander of the Israeli Southern Front. I understand that Dr. Samia, performed a very major role in the recent Operation Protective Edge in the Gaza Strip. Dr. Samia, please.
Thank you, Jacob. And I would like first to thank the organizers of this conference. just having such a conference in these days in the Middle East is a special thing. Thank you. Without derogating from our neighbors, from our armies surrounded us in the Middle East, I'm not sure that you can find such a conference in our neighborhood, mainly not in terror organizations surrounding us in Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, and the West Bank. So thank you for this, and this shows exactly who is the Israeli people, who are the Jewish people, and why we should stay allied with the most of the Western and democratic countries in the world. I would open with some appeals and remarks, and as Jacob says, I was not in my life, in my army life, which ended 15 years ago. Some of the people think that I left the army just yesterday, but it was 15 years ago. The fact that I'm still acting as the deputy commander of the Southern Command, some of my kids says, "Dad, you want to stay young, that's why you're doing it." But it's actually trying to help my former subs, and hopefully it was kind of help. So I would like to appeal on some terms first, which might light the conversation after that. First of all, I don't like the terms purity of arms, or what we says in Hebrew, toar haneshek. That's because simply weapon cannot be pure. Weapon kills people, so how weapon can be pure? And secondly, I prefer the terms ethics of combat, because in many times you don't need a weapon in order to exercise a violence against your other side. So I'm trying to and I wrote this in my book a few times, that it's better to use the term ethics of combat than the purity of arms. The second term I would like to appeal on is the low-intensity conflict, LIC. It sounds very nice. It was good 10, 15, 20 years ago. And the meaning intense was the difference between using divisions, hundreds of tanks, thousands of APCs, thousands of troops. But from my point of view, mainly during the last 15, 20 years, standing in front of this conflict in the Gaza Strip mainly, and some in Lebanon, the intensity on the troops and on the low-level commanders, like platoon leaders, company leaders, brigade, battalion commanders, and sometimes in our army even brigade commanders. We saw it recently. Two of the 8 brigades who took place in the last operation were wounded. That's because they were not behind the screens. They were there in the field. So I think the intensity is not so low. We should stop calling this conflict LIC. It is a very high intense on the soldiers, on the troops, and I think it's derogating of the conflicts in calling it LIC. Second question I ask myself, actually, all this law of wars, rules of engagements, why we need them, and to whom it's important. And my answer comes from my sources, from all our sources, which comes from the phrase, יותר מששמרו בני ישראל את השבת, שמרה השבת את בני ישראל, or more than the people of Israel kept the Shabbat kept the people of Israel. So I'm taking this phrase on the ethic of combats, and I would like to say that more than the IDF will keep the ethic of combat, the ethic of combat will keep the IDF. And this is the important issue, and that's the way I teach my commanders and my soldiers why it is so important. First of all, to us. Secondly, it's important to our society. The IDF is, and I hope will remain, I don't want to open another discussion about the society of Israel now, and I hope it will remain the greenhouse, not the melting pot. With all the respect to David Ben-Gurion, I don't like the term melting pot, because you should melt people in order to make something else. I don't like it. I prefer the term greenhouse. And the army, the IDF, is the greenhouse of the Israeli society. So if you want, if you like a healthy society, you must, or you should be sure that in this greenhouse you are keeping on ethics, because those are the next civilians, the next leaders in our society, either during the wars, between the wars, and especially when they are in their another 50, 80 years as civilians after the army. One more point I would like to raise is the ethics of combat from a leadership point of view, especially on those young commanders in the field. Keeping those ethics became a real and a very high challenge of the young officers. In the past, 20, 30 years ago, challenge was leading the people in the battlefield, being more experts in operating the equipment and all this kind of stuff. But recently, the challenge of keeping these ethics become a very high challenge to the commanders, mainly to the field level, and to the soldiers themselves. And now again, I'm coming to myself. In our research, which most of it in this book, we found out that 95% of the troops in our field units are graduate 12 years and above, what we call high school. And when you have such an amount of high graduate people, by the way, when we compare it 10, 15 years ago, maybe my colleagues from the other armies have other numbers, it was between 25 and 40% in other armies. During the Vietnam War, it was 25% in the US Army. After the draft, it became 45. We start with 95%, which bring us more quality soldiers, qualified soldiers and commanders. And that helps the field level to maintain this challenge. Last point I would like to raise for the beginning is the impact of the ethics of combat. First, from positive point of view. The first one is keeps the unity, or lechidut, the unity of the troops. And one of the biggest challenge of commanders in the battlefield is to keep the unity of troops. And if you keep the ethics, you can be sure it will be easy for you. It's a challenge to keep the unity of the troop. The second one, it safeguards the soul of the troops. And as I said before, if you want a healthy society after that, it's better to avoid damages and sometimes even prevent dealing with what's called PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disaster among soldiers. Last, as I said before, it keeps the society of Israel more healthy and more in higher integrity level. From a negative point of view, of course, every positive has some negative. First of all, it's higher risk in the field, so it's a high risk factor for the troops during the operation, mainly when they become confused, as my colleagues mentioned before, when you are dealing in a neighborhood and a woman or a little child or an old man coming towards you ask for water, but they are wearing an explosive vest. And then, I had, at least when I was a platoon leader, I had exactly the same situation in Lebanon. When a lady came to ask for water, and she had 2 hand grenades open under her dress. And we had 9 wounded among our platoon. So then you come and ask a question about the risk factor. The second, it gives higher motivation among the terror actors or among the terror organization to use the local population for their system, either as a shield or to stay among them because they know that we are keeping on those rules during the conflict. Last but not least, with all the advantages that we have as an IDF, high quality soldiers, commanders, and dealing with such an issue here today, and I can assure you that during the basic training and any commanding course in Israel, in the IDF, this issue takes a major part of the studying and lessons. Again, with a little bit smile, maybe that fact, in long term, I mean, might allow some governments, I'm not talking about the Israeli governments, for God be it, but some governments in the world, kind of an excuse to avoid other solution. That's for my beginning. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ran Bar Yehoshaphat, a former IDF combat soldier and an attorney and policy expert. He is not a general, he is a former combat soldier. So maybe he would give us his perspective. Thank you.
He's the one that the pressure is here.
Thank you very much. I just want to say I'm still a combat soldier, only in the Army Reserves, which I serve about 2 months a year. So I want to begin by saying, thank you. I want to begin by saying we all here agree that there's a need for rules of engagement. We don't believe in the sentence, the famous quote, "When the cannons roared, may the muses be silent." We all share the same values of human life. Let's put this aside for a second because we're already there. I'm going to speak less from the theoretical, deontological, utilitarian perspective and more from the way I see it, or as we say in Israel, tachlis. As a low-ranking commander, when I go on an operation, I get my rules of engagement per mission. Each mission has different needs and different dangers. Now, the way I see it, when I'm getting my orders, I have 3 goals that I wish to achieve in the following order. The first and the foremost important thing is to accomplish the mission, to succeed in the mission that was given to me. That was the number 1 thing I need to keep in my mind. The second thing, second to the accomplishing the mission, is making sure that all of my troops and myself return home safely. The third goal is to make sure that I have as minimum amount of collateral damage as possible. This is the order in my mind, and I also believe it's the correct order when I'm assigned with a mission. I would argue that sometimes the third goal can hurt not only the first goal of accomplishing the mission, but also the lives of my soldiers and myself. And I want to share a story to emphasize this point. During the Second Lebanon War, it was my first Army Reserves, we fought in a village in Lebanon called Drastic. I think at that time I was fired at from all different weapons that I'm familiar with, PK-47, anti-tank missiles, RPGs, grenades, artillery, you name it. And this was obviously after the IDF has sent flyers and said that we're going to come into this village. We know that you're firing rockets at Israel from this perimeter. And at a certain point, we noticed that we were being shot at from a mosque. Now, the orders at that time were you do not fire at holy places. So what you do is you take cover and you call on the radio and you're saying, we're being fired at from a mosque. Are we allowed to fire back? The answer was yes, only if you can spot the person standing there with a gun. Now I'm going to open parentheses for a second. You have to understand that when you're a soldier and you're seeing someone shooting at you from a window and it's nighttime, you don't always see exactly if it's from the window to the right or if it's from the window to the left, and usually you don't see a gun, you see flashes of light. That's what you see. So it's very hard to actually put your head and wait to see if you can see a person standing there with a gun, so that the orders will be, yes, you're allowed to shoot back. Unfortunately, we did get permission eventually to use accurate fire at the mosque. Unfortunately, it was, in my opinion, a bit too late. A soldier from the brigade that was fighting next to us was killed. And it was because it took a very long time to get the permission to fire back. By the way, today the orders have been changed. It's very often that we learn from combat that we need to sometimes change the orders, and there's like a golden rule. If someone is shooting at you, usually, and I'm going to come to why it's usually you're allowed to fire back. Another story just to emphasize this complexity. When I was in advanced training, my base was very close to an Arab school, and we got shot at from the school. What do? You know that the vast majority of the people in the school are children, and you don't know exactly from which window, and if you have kids that are standing next to you, usually do have children standing next to the person who is shooting at you. So at that time, we took cover. It's very unpleasant. You're being shot at, you're taking cover, and you're not returning fire. This story has a happier ending. I have no idea why, but the terrorist decided one day to shoot at nighttime, and we knew that there's no school at nighttime, and we fired back, and that worked better. But it doesn't always work like that. So when it comes to your judgment in the low-ranking levels, for me, for my soldiers, I can divide it into two. One is your judgment, basic judgment. Like I said, the golden rule, if someone is shooting at you, you have a right to protect yourself. The second is the rules themselves. You have a list, rules of engagement. You have different books. You have general rules of engagement for patrols, rules of engagement for wartime. Now, to continue on my former speaker, I would argue that the soldier is not stupid. Sometimes people say soldiers, they don't have, no, they're not stupid. They're very, very smart. They're intelligent. But the problem is that you will always have more circumstances than rules. You will never have enough rules to match each and every sentence that you encounter. And something that we always forget is context, meaning a soldier has a helmet on his head for hours. When you're walking with a helmet, it's harder to think. Second of all, you're carrying weight. I cannot think of anyone who entered Lebanon with less than 100 pounds on their backs. It's more difficult to think when you're doing that. Thirdly, there's adrenaline, you're walking, you're tired. And fourth, you're being shot at. And when you're being shot at, all of this theoretical debate is very nice, but it's very hard to actually follow. What you can follow is the automatic procedures that you were trained. And the automatic procedures that you were trained to do need to be simple, needs to be minimum. You cannot remember 50 different orders if someone is shooting at you, but they're shooting from a PK-47 and they're not, it's too much. It's too much. You need to know when you're supposed to react. Now, about the golden rule of usually when people are shooting at you, you should fire back. I'm saying usually. Why? Because the reality is that warfare is complex. It's much more complex than the theoretical discussions. it's very scary for me as a commander to think of the fact that I'll have to come home and talk to the mom of a soldier that was killed in action. It's more scary for me to think about that if this soldier was killed from friendly fire. So you don't always fire back when people are shooting at you. Sometimes, yes, sometimes you need to say, you need to cease fire and make sure that you're not hurting anyone. So this rule also that if someone is shooting at you, shoot back. That's also not a good rule. It doesn't always work. By the way, sometimes you should shoot even if they're not shooting at you. For instance, you're on a mission, a reconnaissance mission, and you see that the terrorist is about to shoot at another force that doesn't spot the terrorist, or at a civilian. Your life is not a threat, but I would definitely argue that the rules should be, you should be allowed to shoot. Now, what if this person is throwing a cocktail Molotov bottle? It's not so simple now for the soldier on the ground to decide, well, I'm not sure if it's a cocktail Molotov bottle because it's nighttime and I'm 100 yards away. So I see that he's throwing something. If it's a cocktail Molotov bottle and it hits the car, then you might have 4 innocent civilians dead. If you just throw a rock, then maybe the car will detour and you'll have people who were killed and maybe it will just hurt the car. What am I supposed to do? And at that point of time, you don't have a general on the ground starting to explain the whole concept and theories. You have about a split second to react. And that makes it complicated. I want to finish with a very short story. I used to tell this story to college students in the States when they used to ask me, well, why don't you shoot the terrorist in the hand or in the gun or whatever you saw in a different Tom Cruise movie?
His finger.
Just shoot him in the hand.
In his finger.
I would give them this scenario. I would tell them, and I'm just going to tell the story. I'm not going to do the whole scenario with you. I would tell them, imagine that you're a soldier right now, and you have your helmet and your gear, and it's cold outside, but you're sweating because you've been walking so much, and you're trying to find a terrorist. But then a door opens, and you see a 10-year-old kid holding a PK-47 aiming at you. Do you shoot or do you not shoot? American college students, they didn't shoot. For the first time, I would say, okay, but this is a scenario, so we can do it several times. Take a look to your right, take a look to your left. Your friends are dead, and so are you. Well, let's do it again. You go into a village, a door opens, you see a 10-year-old kid holding a gun, aiming at you. Do you shoot or do you not shoot? Some of the kids raised their hands. I said, okay, you're dead, your friend next to you is dead. Let's do it another time. The third time, they all shouted, shoot him, shoot him. I said, okay, you shot the kid. You go over to him, you pick up the gun. It's not loaded. The kid doesn't even know what he's holding. He's a 10-year-old, or he's a 10-year-old kid. Maybe his uncle's a terrorist. He doesn't know what he's holding. You're being placed in an impossible situation. The thing is that the night before, there was a 10-year-old kid who killed your friend and shot him. Now, I have nephews. I don't let them play with guns. I let them play with, I don't know, Smurfs or whatever. My question is, why is there a 10-year-old kid holding a PK-47? I have 3 options here. One is that me and my comrades are all dead now. The second is that I just killed an innocent 10-year-old kid. And the third is that the kid killed an innocent 10-year-old kid. That is the problem with rules of engagement and how complicated it is for the soldier on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Colonel Richard Kemp is a former commander of the British forces in Afghanistan, and I'm sure that you had many confrontations with civilians in Afghanistan, Colonel Kemp.
Thank you very much. Is that working? Yep. Yaakov, it's a real honor to be moderated by you. I've also had the honor of being interviewed by you. Israel's answer to David Frost.
Sir David Frost.
Not quite as attractive as Lucy, who was moderating us yesterday, but close.
Thank you.
The rules of engagement differ for land, sea, air, space, and now, of course, cyberspace. And they often differ for different weapon systems in each of these environments, and also for different and changing circumstances with each weapon system. And in current conflicts, dealing with non-state actors, rules of engagement tend to be far less controversial in the air and at sea than on land, and that's for 2 main reasons. The first one is that the type of conflict that we're engaged in at present, mostly, operations in the air and at sea tend to be more clear-cut than on the land. That's not necessarily always the case. For example, where a US warship might be attacked by a swarm of small boats in a complex situation. We saw what happened to the USS Cole a few years ago. That can be complex, that can be difficult, of course it can, but on the whole it's more clear-cut. Equally in the air, think about the case of warplanes sent up to intercept potential airliners carrying out a 9/11 style attack. That happens more frequently than you may imagine. For example, over UK airspace. I used to be involved in this particular operation. It used to happen, I think it probably still is today, around about a couple of times a week, maybe once a month, or 2 or 3 times a month, something like that. It was a frequent event. And of course that is very complicated, the decision on what you do there. They all have rules of engagement. But generally, and I do stress generally, warplanes and warships operate with relative impunity compared to troops on the ground. Obviously that's not always the case, and we have had cases of warplanes being, or helicopters in particular, being downed in Afghanistan. But one of the main controversies over rules of engagement tend to be the extent to which they put our own troops' lives at risk, and we've heard from a number of panelists today about that particular issue. On the whole, that controversy is more acute than on the ground than in the air and at sea for the reasons I've given. I should point out, of course, that the air-ground interface in terms of rules of engagement is just as problematic as ground operations themselves, and sometimes more so. It frequently causes friction between ground and air commanders because both have their own separate rules of engagement. Usually, by definition, if you think about it, they will be seeing things, the same thing, but from a very different perspective. And so the ground commander sees one picture, is desperate for air support to neutralize or destroy the enemy, to protect his own soldiers, and he calls in that air support. But the pilot and the weapons operator in the air see things differently. They can't see the enemy, maybe. They think or understand that the civilian population is too close, and so they don't fire. And that again, that causes some real problems. And obviously the commander on the ground really wants the air commander to obey his commands to fire, but the air commander can't do so unless he's satisfied that he meets his own ROE. And I can tell you of a number of cases where that has caused severe friction between air and ground commanders. But I'm going to focus most of my remarks today on land operations, because, as I mentioned, that's where most, I think, of the controversy over rules of engagement apply. In circumstances of insurgents and terrorist fighting environments like Gaza, Afghanistan, Iraq, usually wearing civilian clothes and blending in among the civilian population and using human shields. When you have that circumstance and our soldiers are confronted with it, it is vital that they're given rules of engagement. This is not it's a constraint, yes. It is not a disadvantage, it's an advantage to have that. Many people believe that in the First World War, the Second World War, there were no rules of engagement. Of course there were rules of engagement. They were different, the circumstances were different, but there were rules of engagement. May not have even been called that, but they existed. But they're vital in a way that's different to total war. When you have very limited war, like Afghanistan, Iraq, Gaza, rules of engagement become increasingly important and increasingly more difficult. They also exist in situations like more limited war situations like Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War in 1991, and some of the conflicts in the Balkans. And restrictive ROE there were necessary, not so much to protect the lives of innocent civilians, because in many of those circumstances the problem didn't apply, particularly in the desert. But they were necessary in order to avoid escalating a conflict or expanding a conflict beyond what the political leaders and senior military commanders wanted to happen. And that really is what rules of engagement is all about, or should be. They should be the distillation of government policy as applicable to a particular conflict or campaign, and the military strategy for achieving the political objectives. That's what the ROE is. Basically, those two things distilled down into a form that guides those whose job it is to fight the battle. And of course, in addition to that, the ROE must take into account the laws of war. So it's not just a guide to keep troops within the laws of war, but it's also a guide to try to ensure that their behavior reflects what the politicians and the generals want to happen. Now, a lot of us, given rules of engagement, we don't want it. I don't want some general telling me what to do. But at the same time, I do want to tell my troops what to do. So, you know, you've got to, if you're going to want to exercise control over your troops, you have to accept control from the top as well. So it's easy to criticize rules of engagement, but they are important. And there is not, therefore, I think there's nothing intrinsically wrong, as the question perhaps suggests, with rules of engagement as a concept. They're indispensable as a concept. They're frequently held up as a cause of friendly casualties. The reason the enemy escaped to fight another day. And ROE is a very convenient scapegoat. But when these problems occur, they're usually the result either of ill-judged policies that are reflected in the ROE or misunderstanding and misinterpretation of rules of engagement, which in my experience can be quite commonplace. The problem of misinterpretation can be overcome or reduced, shall we say, by extensive training in ROE. Modern technology allows extremely effective interactive scenario-based training for troops at every level before operational deployment. And that sort of thing is absolutely critical that rules of engagement are understood, practiced, that they're simple, and that a soldier under pressure, as Rand said, wearing a helmet, carrying 100 pounds, being shot at, seeing his mate blown apart, still can understand what he's supposed to do. And one of the greatest criticisms of rules of engagement in Afghanistan from 2009 onwards was that it put troops' lives at greater risk than necessary. It led to the loss of lives of our own forces and allowed terrorists to kill in the future. It wasn't a problem of ROE, it was a problem of judgment, I think, the judgment that called for courageous restraint. We heard read out General McChrystal's analysis of the situation. I happen to disagree with General McChrystal on this issue. And I think that the judgment that we should maybe exercise courageous restraint, sacrifice the lives of our men in order to win the hearts and minds of the population of Afghanistan was not entirely wrong, but I think was slightly flawed. And I think we tended to see, and I'm not specifically criticizing General McChrystal for this, because I think it applied to many commanders. We saw the inhabitants of Afghanistan, we thought they had the same mindset as we do. They don't. They, above all, the inhabitants of Afghanistan respect strength. They despise weakness. And that's for very good reason, because their lives in many parts of Afghanistan are dominated by one kind of military-type force or another. If they see British or American forces withdrawing in the face of fire because they're exercising courageous restraint because there's a risk of killing innocent civilians, then they will see weakness in that. And when they know that their lives, not just the lives of one or two people who happen to be located with the insurgents, but the life of the whole village, the whole community, when they see that those lives are at stake and are in the hands of either the Taliban, who never show weakness, never, or NATO forces who frequently showed weakness, they weren't weak, but they showed weakness, then I don't think we're not going to be winning the hearts and minds, we're going to be losing the hearts and minds. Maybe they like us more because we're nicer to them when we give their kids candy. But ultimately, they see the Taliban as being the ones who are going to dominate and essentially take control. So I think that's a bit of a misjudgment that also caused significant morale problems among our troops in Afghanistan. And I can tell you, I wasn't in Afghanistan at the time General McChrystal was operating this policy, but I know many soldiers who were, and there was huge disquiet, both among American soldiers and British soldiers who also had to follow that policy. That they tried to overcome the policy that said you cannot shoot unless you're shot at by using themselves as bait for the Taliban, to lure the Taliban to attack them. Now, and then they could fire back. Now, clearly that is a way of doing it, but it's incredibly dangerous and I think probably cause lives. I would also question the extent to which we really looked at the other means. And I think if we do want to be more certain of killing only terrorists and not killing innocent civilians, I think there are various means of doing that. Now, until 2009, if you spotted somebody on a motorbike in the desert with a radio, for no apparent reason, you assumed that it's giving information to someone to set up an attack against you, and you shot and killed him. Or you brought an airstrike against him if you couldn't. That was no longer possible after 2009. But there are other ways of identifying. It was only possible once someone was shooting at you with a weapon. But there are other ways. So it's not just carrying weapons that can identify an enemy threat. How they behave. I just mentioned one example, on bikes with radios. Digging, for no apparent reason, digging a hole. From intelligence, and obviously we can talk about photographic intelligence, satellite intelligence, communications intercept, human sources. All of these things can allow friendly forces enough information to be able to attack without simply having to rely on being shot at first. I think just a couple of other issues I want to raise on ROE before I finish. One of which is, and we have had it spoken about a few times before already this morning. The ROE raises, this whole question of ROE raises the issue of whether the lives of local civilians or enemy civilians, depending on the circumstances, is more important than the lives of our own troops. This is not an ROE issue solely, it also relates to proportionality calculations, it relates to human shields and so on that we were discussing yesterday. But should avoiding killing of innocent civilians result in the deaths of our own soldiers? Should a commander accept that if he protects innocent civilians, his soldiers should die as a consequence? Which life has more value? The life of somebody who is an innocent civilian, unengaged, or of a soldier, or a person who happens to be a soldier at that moment? Is his life less valuable than the life of an innocent civilian? Do civilians have a greater right to life? These are questions, these are difficult questions for a commander to come to. Should a soldier be expected to take risks to protect the lives of innocent civilians? I believe, yes, they should be expected to take risks to protect the lives of innocent civilians, not necessarily risking their own life, but they should be prepared to take some risk. And indeed, there are many cases, I'm sure the same applies here in Israel, there are many cases of American and British soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan sacrificing their own lives to save innocent civilians. But can you actually expect people to do that? Can you require them to do that? The fact is they will, because they're generally very brave, heroic people, and they will do that, and they have morality. Apart from the moral issues, though, commanders must also consider the importance of maintaining their combat power. If a nation has sent military forces to fight, what they're doing is extremely important to that nation, and preservation of the means to do it is vital. So maintaining your combat power means you don't allow your soldiers to get killed or seriously wounded, and that must be a major consideration for commanders, perhaps more important than saving the lives of innocent civilians. And there's also the issue, which people do tend to forget unless they've actually been in that position, as many on this panel have, that how long is a soldier going to follow you for if you spend his life too easily? How long? I would argue not very long. And it's quite easy to recognize whether a commander is profligate with the lives of a soldier or not. And again, it's critical for military effectiveness. We can't afford to have commanders who lose the confidence of their soldiers. I think training and understanding of ROE is vital. I've mentioned it before. The more restrictive it is, the more important training is to ensure the soldiers don't hesitate at the critical moment. And contrary to RAN in the IDF, all soldiers are absolutely brilliant and extremely intelligent. Not true in the British Army. We do have some stupid soldiers. And those stupid soldiers have to be catered for in the same, in some way, and so we have to make sure it's all understandable. And this does go to Professor Korn's excellent point made yesterday in his presentation in the proportionality debate about taking precautionary measures before we go into battle. There's a saying that I'm particularly fond of, which is that rules are for the guidance of wise men and the obedience of fools. Laws aren't, but rules are, and rules of engagement are for the guidance of wise men and the obedience of fools. A military officer or soldier is not there to slavishly and blindly follow instructions and follow orders, particularly if the situation's changed since the orders were given. And on many occasions, on some occasions, I have disobeyed the rules of engagement, not because I just want to be, out of line or whatever, but because the circumstances are such that I believe that the rules of engagement are wrong. As long as I can justify that afterwards, then, or if I'm prepared to take the consequences of a court-martial and imprisonment if I actually have been wrong myself, then that's fine. But I need to be able to justify that, but I should be able to adjust the rules of engagement if I feel that they're not appropriate to a specific situation. I think that is what fairly widely accepted, and to disobey the rules of engagement is not necessarily to break the law. Finally, I think rules of engagement should be drafted and designed in such a way that they give the maximum possible freedom of action to commanders and to troops. minimum restrictions should be placed on them in a situation which is by definition going to be changing fast, highly variable, and in many cases very unpredictable. I'm also aware that the actions of a single corporal in the 21st century can have massive strategic impact in a way that never in history could that have happened, with the glare of the media, communications, and so on. But nevertheless, despite that, I do think that commanders and soldiers have the maximum possible freedom of action. As a former commander myself, I like nothing better than to be given no orders, so I could carry out the mission any way I liked. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask the members of the panel a question which is not has a direct which is not, is outside the direct of the main subject of the discussion. I would like to ask you about the impact of so-called external organizations, like human rights organizations. Do they have any impact in their reports on the soldiers and especially on the commanders? Do they influence? Do they have an impact? Do they succeed in changing the tactics of or the instructions of the commanders? General?
Okay. I'll just very briefly touch on this. In the British Army, I think the answer is generally no. And one of the reasons for that, although there were exceptions, I think, in Northern Ireland, where we came under quite significant scrutiny from human rights groups a lot of the time. But one of the reasons for the fact that I say no, that human rights groups, reports, as I said, don't particularly influence us, is because we don't come under immense scrutiny from them. I mean, and I think probably there's a difference between UK forces and Israeli forces. I'm not saying that the Israeli forces are necessarily influenced by Human Rights Watch, but we, the Brits, do not come under the same level of scrutiny. So we don't have to pay that much attention to what they're saying. We do obviously take note of it, but I don't think that their reports particularly influence our actions.
Thank you, General.
In the Philippines, when we started the mission in 2002, there was a commission called the Visiting Forces Commission that helped instill from the Philippine government. They came down there and let us know that they were there to physically observe and watch our actions. After 2 months, they got bored and went home. And the reason being is that we conducted ourselves in accordance with, professional soldiers in the ROE. They expected different behavior, and quite honestly, we told them we were not young soldiers. Special Forces guys generally are older, more mature, have been in the force for at least anywhere from 5 to 15 years when they join up. And, true to our profession, we acted accordingly, and they went away out of boredom. So, but they were actually looking for behavior and for, contradictory behavior. We didn't provide that. So, I think if you have, now I will say that sometimes when the Red Cross would come to visit certain places, they would take, not in our instance, but hearing this from Iraq and Afghanistan experience, they would, certain commanders would take extraordinary, I think, sensing to have them properly guided, but still we're very transparent.
I'm asking this question because maybe some of you read the morning newspaper about the report of an Israeli group organization which called Breaking the Silence.
Yes,
Yeah,
no,
okay.
but not
They collected evidence from soldiers, anonymous soldiers, about cases of misconduct during operations. And
I will challenge the answer as well. So I agree with my colleagues, but I would like to put some remarks or comments on it. In healthy army, no, I don't care what they are saying, all those guys. When the leaders of the army are care or their reaction is because of these guys are saying, these organizations are saying, that means we are sick army or sick society. I already put 2 or 3 reasons, internal reasons, why it is so important. So why the hell I need someone from outside who never was there to tell me why it's important? I have enough reasons internally to keep my troops, to keep my soldiers, to keep my society, so I don't need him or them for that. So what I would say that we as generals, former generals, but the acting generals and commanders must give a full backing to their subordinates as long as they are doing mistakes of distractions, not crime. When they are doing crime, we should put them on their place and give them to, bring them to judge or whatever needed. But as long as those guys are doing mistakes of distractions, that's happened. As most of my colleagues already described, it is not black and white in this area. As we said in Hebrew, "Metziut yoter ashira min hadimyon." The reality on earth, it's much more rich than any imagination and any previous written rights or rules that you can write. And always you have to rely on your commanders that they're allowed to do mistakes as long as discretion's mistakes, not crimes.
Thank you. Ran Bar Yoshafat, please.
Thank you very much. I think that there's a tremendous effect on Israel when it comes to these organizations. I want to say a few things. Look, the IDF is not perfect. No army is perfect, and it's fine if someone wants to question what the IDF is doing in order to improve. I think that's terrific. I personally have a problem with this organization that publishes most of its material in English, which doesn't seem to really try to manifest Israel, but mainly to put pressure on Israel. I could also refer to a lot of lies that I know because I read most of the testimonies, but I don't really think that that's the main issue. I think the main issue is the stuff that are actually correct. I just don't think that they're a problem. So I think it's very connected to our panel. I remember I read one testimony that says, the orders were to shoot. If someone is throwing a cocktail Molotov bottle at you, you shoot him. And I'm like, yeah, that's what you're supposed to do. There's nothing wrong with it. But if you give it to a college student that has no idea what a cocktail Molotov bottle, it's like a grenade, then it's something that's very, very problematic. Now, my problem with it is that it damages the motivation, because I have friends that have been killed in protective edge operation because they were, in my opinion, too humane and too concerned with the rules of engagement. They didn't want to bomb a house that was an UNRWA medical center that was booby-trapped, and they were killed because they were sent inside, and then people say we use too much force. Now, I'm not saying that you cannot find an incident or here or there, and it's fine, and we need to interrogate it, but to vilify the name of the IDF, to me personally, I think it's an insult, and I think it's very problematic because it takes down the motivation of soldiers, and you're saying this is hurting my friends who have fallen.
Okay, for the last 10 minutes, maybe people would like to put some question to the
Okay, we're
panel.
going to enforce the rule from yesterday. Everybody gets one sentence, a sentence that starts with a question word, like
Not a
where,
speech, a
or
question.
what, or when. There are other forms for comments. This is only for questions, okay? Okay?
Who will side by the following statement? We can't compare Israel's wars to America's war in Afghanistan. Neither can we talk of Western morality at war applying to Israel. In the same way, that's a comma. It's not a full stop. In the same way Herzl spoke of an alte neue Land, so should we speak of an alte neue law of war, because Jews have their own laws. Our freedom fighters who made way for the state of Israel by fighting away the British are called biryonim, hooligans, terrorists. So there's a difference between Jewish terrorists and Arab or ICC terrorists. The Jewish, comma, there wasn't a full stop here. The Jewish rule of engagement in, I asked the question, will you agree with I boiled it down. I've got much more to say. The Jewish rule of engagement is that there are two kinds of wars, an obligatory war and a voluntary war. And the morality is indeed the law for a soldier fighting an obligatory war, which is written in our law, which I will not quote. You can refer to the Rambam's Laws of Wars. If we want...
Okay.
What's your question?
I see who does not agree with this statement, and I know that there are plenty of others who do agree with my statement. This is how the issue stands.
Thank you. Next.
Thank you. We know that the law of warfare is fixed, although it can be amended, but rules of conduct, they can vary between countries, and there's not an absolute standard, I would imagine. That undermines their validity, I think. But going one step further, since this whole conversation is based on asymmetry, we're assuming asymmetry between one side and the other side. But all sides are not equal in the sense that if you look at the Western world, the developed world, defending against insurgencies, then what different rules of conduct will there be if you have a rich country or a poor country in fighting the insurgents? Is there a different rules of conduct? Are there different standards? Or if part of the battle line is to bankrupt you by constantly bleeding you with fights and fights and fights, then do you have a right to fight on the cheap? Or must you always finance a high missiles, like a high expensive war? Thank you.
That's a valid, that's a very good question. I'll take the first shot at it and then let somebody else give it a go. What we found out, and I think is best I can understanding what you've asked, there's also an asymmetry in alliances. And what we found is that's what I think in some ways, to invoke his name, General McChrystal again, was very good about bringing the interagency together, and that you used a variety of different means and authorities, which also gave you a different standard of abilities to go after target sets. And I think that was one of the greatest things that he learned when he went to Iraq, and then took it and brought it, somewhat of that, over into Afghanistan as well. It didn't work as well as in Afghanistan for a variety of reasons. But he understood that the interagency and using other forces that had both limits and different restrictions, maybe not as restrictive in nature, could be used to his advantage against, again, a very, very broad enemy. I'll stop there. There's something else I'll try and come back to in a minute. Anybody else want to go at it?
Okay.
Rachel's rules of engagement.
Be careful.
Question. Goel, I know you can do this.
I would like for you to address the differences and gaps between domestic rules of engagement.
Can you-
The differences and gaps between the domestic rules of engagement in certain countries and international rules of engagement. And Fridovich, you mentioned for specific missions that they're classified because the enemy you don't want an enemy to take advantage of the certain rules, but if the courts go by international rules, then they are publicized and the enemy can take advantage of it. So how does it affect the strategic considerations and also just any differences in terms of the both sets of rules?
I mean, if you look at that second chart that I had, the Venn diagram, the only one of those circles that's constant for everyone in the world is the law. The law is the law, but frankly, what UK's, United Kingdom's political or operational issues or concerns may well be and often is different than, say, Israel or the United States. So the other three circles, the intersection of which constitutes the ROE, are going to vary across the board, across the world, with the law being the only constant.
I would like to ask, since the United Nations has been responsible for so many thoughts and rules on the disengagement process, they were actively involved in Operation Protective Edge when they allowed their schools to be used and even cooperated with Hamas in allowing the schools to be used as points where they could kill the civilians. Now, there are 2 points to my question now. One being, if they can use the idea that they are forced, can't any army be used and use the same rule that they are forced? Certainly when the mosque was shooting at soldiers, the soldiers are forced. So that's one question. And secondly, can the United Nations itself be held accountable by being charged in the ICC or other organs with actively engaging in shooting civilians?
I'll just briefly try and give my view on that anyway. First of all, I think you were saying that if a mosque, for example, is used as a missile launch point or a storage point for weapons, then can we attack that? The answer is, of course, yes, we can and frequently do. So I think a protected building under the laws of armed conflict, a protected building loses its protection when it's used as a military objective of some sort for military purposes. And the second point about the United Nations, a body that we all have immense respect for. I'm sure you're aware there has been an investigation conducted by the Secretary General of the United Nations, which had its results published a few days ago, into that very issue. And it did find that UN facilities, UNRWA facilities in particular, in Gaza had been used illicitly for military purposes. The thing I missed in that whole report was, so what? What are we going to do about that? What action is going to be taken against the UNRWA officials who have allowed that to happen? And I agree with you. That if anyone's going to the ICC, it should be them.
Thank you.
Dr. Samia mentioned that one of the benefits of obeying the laws of war and the rules of engagement is keeping the unity of troops and safeguarding the soldiers' souls. Now, I would like to ask Dr. Samia and perhaps Professor Jenks, will those benefits hold if combat soldiers think that those rules are fundamentally unjust?
Fundamentally what?
Unjust.
It's all issue of common sense on the ground. So saying from here in the air condition unjust or unjust, it's really too theoretical. So I think that our rules of engagements and the fact that we instruct our low-level commanders like platoons, companies, battalions, that they are the commanders on the ground. Or in our phrase, we said, you are the chief of staff on the ground. When you are there, you are the chief of staff. You have all the army backing you as long as you are acting under common sense. And I will back you up. I will go with you to any valley, to any court, to any place, as long as, and I back you for any mistake you did, as long as your mistakes is, again, is destruction mistakes, which everybody can do, especially in these occasions, and as long as I'm sure it's not a crime. You didn't came to the field to do a crime. And all the rest is in his hands.
Thank you.
I guess I would just add, I think counterinsurgency in particular, the tension is it's at odds with how we've inculcated, I think, the soldiers' ethos. I mean, I can only speak for the U.S. military, although I'm quite sure it's the same in all militaries. You inculcate a sense that a service member will unflinchingly put themselves in harm's way, give their life, frankly, not for some greater cause or a country, but for the fellow soldier to their left and to their right. And so when you're operating in that paradigm, you don't really have much pushback. In fact, that's, I think, implicitly understood by soldiers around the world, where the tension is that you're putting yourself in harm's way, your life may be risked or that of your comrades for that civilian in a foreign country who you don't know, who maybe doesn't even appreciate or maybe even respect the sacrifice that you and your comrades are making. So I think that's a tension that is constantly going to be at issue, more so in a counterinsurgency environment than other forms of combat.
But to add to that, if I might, and this is a unabashed parochial plug for Special Forces. We train and select our men, and probably soon women, quite honestly, to be able to deal with environments that have no correct right answer all the time. The ambiguity of counterinsurgency and unconventional warfare lend themselves to having people who know how to think. So again, you give them guiding principles, you empower them to say, here's what success looks like, and it certainly is for the Moscow Janowitz primary group, but beyond that, that inherent right of self-defense is to go out and go forth and do great things. And that means, here's what success looks like, go do it, what do you need to be successful? And they understand, and again, they're actually selected and trained, and I've talked to senior leadership of the IDF about how do you do that, asking them to come to Fort Bragg and take a look. But, so it's not as black and white. I want to, this is kind of tongue-in-cheek. There are 50 shades of gray here, There you go. So the point is, for the force that knows how to do quite a bit of this, again, it's in our military, the U.S. military, it's the Special Forces, but they are selected and trained to do just that. So it's a little bit broader, not very deep, broader.
Thank you.
Okay, we really only have a few more minutes, so everybody just needs to be very quick, and I'll try to get to everybody, okay?
Are any of the members of the panel aware of the essay that was written about 5 years ago by Professor Asa Kasher, who drew up the military code of ethics, in Israel? This essay appeared in Azure to Khalid, I think in the year 2010, after the 2009 conflict in Gaza. This essay deals extensively with the issues that were raised in this morning's panel.
Thank you.
Hello. With all due respect, this question is intended to our American friends, and it's purely hypothetical. But imagine yourselves now, you're in command and you have extra professional training, and now your borders of the states that you represent are near the Taliban. The U.S. border is on Afghanistan or Great Britain. Would your rules of engagement change then as vis-a-vis your opponent? And how would they change?
I'm not American, but very briefly, I mean, we had that sort of situation for about 30 years in Northern Ireland, and some of it was very intensive conflict. Our rules of engagement for most of that time were much the same as, for example, your rules of engagement are in the West Bank today. It was a similar kind of situation, and we followed those same rules of engagement. I'm not talking now about missiles being fired into London. I think that'd be a different ballgame, or indeed tunnels.
I mean, I'm not sure how they would change in the United States, but I'm sure that they would change. I mean, clearly, in the U.S., in the United Kingdom, we deploy to combat. We leave the United States and go elsewhere in the world, our militaries, versus the IDF, the Israeli population, lives with either combat or the threat of combat. And so certainly, I'm sure we would have it. Our perspective would change if that reality was different, that we bordered a threat as Israel does, excuse me.
I'm not an American as well, although I live in New York part of my time, but it must be changed because the order of keeping lives as a soldier, that's what I was taught, and that's what I teach. First of all is my civilian, in our case, keeping the life of the civilian of Israel, then my troops or my left hand or my team. The third is the other side civilians, and only the fourth is the fighters on the other side. So once the first belong to your border, Mexico or Canada or wheresoever, of course they must change.
Very quickly, we did an exercise at the U.S. Army JAG School that I thought was very illuminating on this point. Broke down the officers into 3 groups, separate groups. They were all given the same scenario. The only difference was one group had a scenario based in Iraq or Afghanistan. The other group, but it was the same facts and the same question asked. The second group had a scenario of an imaginary Atlantica and Cortinia, non-existent countries. And then the third group had, again, the same facts, only it was Cleveland in the state of Ohio in the U.S. And ultimately the question was, do you use force? And frankly, the answer should be the same. Whatever that answer is, with the same predicate fact pattern, it should be the same. And what we saw was either imaginary countries or countries not yours, you're much more aggressive and will use force, and people were much more restrained when it was the idea of, well, no, this is Cleveland. I know Cleveland. So I thought that was an interesting example of how your perspective changes depending on where and from where the threat is faced.
I'm still not an American, but can I make a final point from me, which is that the last time that Britain was threatened with rockets being fired at it, which was 1943. I'm not quite sure what rules of engagement were applied, but Winston Churchill sent 1,000 bombers to go and bomb the plant where the rockets were being developed in one night. And as a consequence of that, I think something in the region of 400 innocent civilians were killed in that raid alone. He didn't like it up him, as they say in Dad's Army.
General Friedovich, did you have something to add?
No,
okay.
I'll talk to you later on.
I wanted to ask if preemptive strikes are legal, and what are the rules of engagement for preemptive strikes?
She asked if preemptive strikes are legal and what are the rules of engagement.
One of my comments, I have 4 comments about the last operation, but one of them was regarding preemptive war, that I think this is our biggest and first mistake during the last 10 years or 15 years, that we were so good on the 6-day war that we started the war because it seems a threat on Israel, and our leaders didn't see 32 tunnels and 10,000 missiles as a threat on Israel. And the mistake of the last operation is it starts almost by an accident. Unfortunately, it's a very sad accident, the kidnap of the 3 guys. But imagine if this kidnap weren't happened at that time, maybe we were surprised in the eve of Leila Seder.
Professor Jenks, I got the impression from your talk that, first of all, you did state that in counterinsurgency, it's very important to not get on the bad side to the extent practical of the indigenous population. Are you conflating counterinsurgency with counterterrorism? And what do you do? Do you still label counterinsurgency when at least a plurality, if not a majority, of the indigenous population is going to be exceedingly hostile to you no matter how much candy you give out?
I mean, I'm not conflating counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, and I'm not sure really that what I was saying was that different than at least either my colleagues to the left and right. I mean, what did Ron say? Ron said, what was his first goal? His first mission, his first goal was not protect his troops. It was not ensure I bring everyone back. That was not his first goal. That was the second one. That is subordinate to his first goal, accomplish the mission. So recognizing that we're going to accept some risk, that we're going to work on 1 before we get to 2. My difficulty with the tactical directive, and I highlighted General McChrystal's, what I probably should have done is highlighted also General Petraeus. So General McChrystal laid out, you, the force, you are going to accept more risk to protect the population. As Colonel Kemp said, there's risk, someone's going to have to bear it. Frankly, if there's a question between the civilian population and trained and equipped military, oftentimes I think that answer is the military should bear the risk. General McChrystal was at least candid in essentially rank ordering things, as my IDF colleague did. General Petraeus, in contrast, reissued the tactical directive and claimed that protecting the civilian population and protecting the force were co-equal moral imperatives. That to me is like saying you have 2 number 1 priorities. So while my colleagues may not, frankly, care for General McChrystal's version, I would submit they're better able to function with General McChrystal's version of the directive, where things are prioritized, than General Petraeus, where we say everything is co-equal, you have 2 number 1 priorities.
I would like to exploit my position in order to put another question.
Please do.
Maybe our guests are aware of the fact that the role of the Israeli Supreme Court in the Israeli political system is very controversial, especially now, after the elections, because members of the Knesset, of the parliament, they put bills in order to change the function or even to limit the function of the Supreme Court in Israel. And I would like to ask Professor Jenks, who is a law professor, has the Supreme Court in Washington issued any rulings about the performance of the American forces either in Iraq or in Afghanistan? I mean, has the Supreme Court in America is being involved in this kind of issue, legal issue?
Short answer is no. Detainee issues, the rights and process afforded to those that are in Guantanamo Bay and the conduct of military commissions have been and continue to be the subject of extensive litigation. Service member misconduct has certainly been dealt with, and that's handled through service courts, military courts martials, but there has not been anything akin to the targeted killings case here in Israel, or frankly, the decisions that are occurring in the United Kingdom, which I think are operationally impacting the military. We have not had that in the U.S., no.
Okay, I think we have to thank the members of the panel.
Thank you very much. Members of the panel. Thank you to our moderator. Ladies and gentlemen,